This week from the Global Lane in New York City at the United Nations. Hostility at the UN and growing threats from Iran and Turkey. How should Israel and the United States respond? We'll bring you Gordon Robertson's exclusive interview with Israel's ambassador to the UN. And you've probably heard of Corrie ten Boom and Oskar Schindler. They helped save Jewish lives from the Nazis. But we'll reveal how smugglers helped preserve something of priceless value long after the Holocaust. And on the home front, another big march on Washington. This time, American students demand tougher gun laws. Welcome to the revolution. And growing concern from American college students about restrictions on free speech. But what about hate speech on campus? Should that be banned? We'll set it straight. Our man on the street asks people what they think of the Holocaust. Do they even know what it is? And I'll drive it home on Israel, Iran, Putin, Erdogan, and biblical prophecy. It's all right here, right now from New York City and the Global Lane.
Ambassador, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Gordon.
Let's start with your career. You've been the Israeli ambassador to the UN for 3 years. Have you noticed any changes in that time period?
Well, first of all, the UN is a hostile territory for the Israeli ambassador. We still see a lot of hostility, but I feel the change. I feel the change, especially since Ambassador Haley stepped in a little bit more than a year ago, and we achieved a lot at the UN. What bothers me is that I see the difference between the public UN and the private UN. Privately, ambassadors will reach out to me, will tell me how much they appreciate Israel, even admire Israel. But then when it comes to public votes, we don't see it yet. My challenge is to close the gap between the private UN and the public UN.
You've been trying to educate the UN ambassadors on Israel, on Judaism. You held the first Seder service in the history of the UN, and you just finished an exhibit talking about the 3,000-year history of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Are you seeing a change in perception as a result of this?
We do, and the best tool is to bring the ambassadors to Israel. So the exhibitions are great. The lectures are great. You know, we're having every year a Seder at the UN. We tell them about the Jewish heritage. But once the ambassadors actually come to Israel, once they walk in the city of David, they get it.
Do you ever find a point of irony that you walk into the UN, you see a scripture from Isaiah about beating swords into plowshares, and the UN has become a weapon against Israel?
Indeed. And I think the majority in the world wants the UN to deal with the positive issues. But unfortunately, the leaders who come here use the UN to attack Israel. And I think we can change it. We think the majority of the people in the world understand that Israel is not the problem. Israel is the solution. We, in Judaism, we have a special value which is called in Hebrew tikkun olam, to repair the world. We believe we can help so many people around the world with agriculture technology, desalination, health issues, and we want to do it. That's why we hope that we will see that change coming soon.
Why is that so prevalent in Israeli society? I've interviewed a lot of Israelis, and it seems to just instinctively come from them. We are to be a light to the nations. I find that unique. I don't find that in other cultures, that they identify themselves as we're here to help. Why is that?
This is part of being Jews, to support others, to bring our knowledge to others. We see missions going from Israel to support communities all around the world. And I'm very hopeful because I think with the technology today, we have a lot of technology that will support the world. We will see that we have more friends around the world.
What do you think of UNRWA? Right now, President Trump has said his administration is going to withhold $360 million. And there are now publicized reports that UNRWA is going to run out of money by this summer. Are you anticipating that? What are the ramifications of that?
First, let's understand what the story with UNRWA is all about. In 1949, it was established to support the Palestinian refugees. And unfortunately, UNRWA, instead of supporting the refugees, they're inciting against Israel. Look at the schools in UNRWA, the curriculum, what they are teaching the kids. So I think that the US should consider what they're doing with their funds, with the taxpayers' money. They should support humanitarian causes, but they should not support incitement.
There's talk that if UNRWA goes away, the Palestinian Authority will collapse. Do you share that view?
No, I think it is not the case. You have other agencies who can do that work. You know, UNRWA today will consider refugees even people who live in the US, people who live in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, even those Palestinians who live in Ramallah, under the Palestinian Authority control, they consider to be refugees.
What do you think of the Taylor Force Act? It's gone through the House of Representatives. It's seemingly delayed at the U.S. Senate. And the act is designed to stop American taxpayer funds from paying for pay to slay and paying to reward terrorist acts against Israel.
I hope it will go through because today Abu Mazen, President Abbas, is taking $340 million from the money he gets from the US and other countries, and he gives it directly to terrorists who killed Israelis and Americans. I met the parents of Taylor Force only a week ago here in New York, and I told them that we salute to them the way they speak and present the case of their brave son, and I hope that the reality will change and American taxpayers' money will not be used to support terrorism.
Let's talk about politics within Israel. And you've gone on record saying the two-state solution won't work. Do you still think that?
I represent the Israeli government. Prime Minister Netanyahu said in numerous occasions that he is willing to negotiate with the Palestinians, to enter a room and negotiate, exactly the way we did it with Jordan and with Egypt.
Do you see that as realistic? Anwar Sadat, it cost him his life. He was assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood precisely because he made peace with Israel. Do you see any Palestinian leader surviving who actually gets to a negotiating table and says, I want to be serious about peace with Israel?
We pray for peace every day, and I'm optimistic. So today it's very hard to see it, and people are skeptical in Israel about finding a real partner among the Palestinians, but we have to be optimistic about it. Also, we have to take into consideration that Israel is a young country. Today we celebrate only 70 years of independence. So maybe it will take another 5 years, another 10 years, but once we will find a real partner, we will be there, we will be willing to work together with them, the same way we did with the Egyptians and the Jordanians.
What would you say would be the signs that they are really serious about doing that?
Unfortunately, it is not the case. Take Gaza, for example. We took out the entire Jewish community that lived in the Gaza Strip. I was against it back then in 2005. And look what happens there. Instead of developing agriculture, tourism, they built an entity of terror. They use the funds from the international community to build terror tunnels that threaten Israeli communities in the south. So you ask yourself, what is the goal of the Palestinians? And unfortunately today, when we hear what they are saying in Arabic in the mosques, they are not focused in building a society, hospitals, schools. They put all their energy to build measures to destroy Israel.
Do you see any hope?
We have to see hope. We have to be optimistic.
I know we have to, but do you actually see it?
I do. You know, I'm a believer, and every day when I enter the UN and I see the hostility against Israel, you have to believe and to be optimistic. And when I walk in Israel and I see how much we achieved in short 70 years, I think we can achieve much more. So yes, maybe it will take a few more years for our neighbors to come and speak with us. But when you look at what's happening today in Syria and Lebanon, I think even the people who live in those countries understand that one day they want to live peacefully with Israel because the option to live under radical regime is a bad option for them.
You've got a platform right now where you're talking to hundreds of thousands of Christians in the United States and then an untold number around the world. What message do you have for them as the Israeli ambassador?
Speak up for Israel. We need you to stand with Israel, to pray for Israel, because many Israelis think that everybody is against us, that we have to make concessions to satisfy the world. I know it is not the case. So we need the supporters of Israel to be more vocal, to be more involved with what's happening in Israel. It is very important for us. We need that support.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
You've probably heard of Corrie ten Boom and Oskar Schindler, people who helped Jews escape death during the Nazi Holocaust of World War II. But you probably haven't heard about Christians who helped preserve Jewish art and antiquities. Author David Fishman has written about it. He even won a 2017 National Jewish Book Award for the book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis. Mr. Fishman, thank you for joining us today. How come few people have ever heard of the smugglers, even though they risked their lives for something so valuable to the European Jewish community?
Maybe because it took place in a far-off place in an obscure city called Vilna, or today Vilnius. And a lot of the sources about this story are in small languages like Yiddish. So I'm hoping my book will bring broader attention to something that it deserves broad attention.
Why did the Nazis insist on destroying the Jewish art, even the poems? Were they hoping that all Jewish presence then could be exterminated by them taking such actions?
That's exactly right. Actually, the Nazis did two things. They destroyed most of Jewish books and documents, manuscripts, and art. But what they considered to be valuable for their own purposes, they actually sent off to Germany to specialized institutes, to study the Jews. The Nazis wanted to exterminate the Jews, but they wanted to show scientifically, quote unquote, that was necessary, that it was necessary to exterminate the Jews. So they actually had specialized scholars, Nazi scholars, on the Jews. And some of these books and cultural treasures ended up being sent to Germany.
So what specifically, can you give us a couple of examples of what some Christians did to preserve some of this artwork?
The rescue work went on both by Jews and by Christians. There was a group of Jewish slave laborers who worked for the Nazis exactly doing this job, sorting what would be sent to Germany and what would be sent to be destroyed. The majority had to be destroyed. And there was a work site outside the ghetto in the city. And the Germans did not guard the work site during the lunch hour. And there were Christian friends for these Jewish slave laborers who would come visit their friends during the lunch hour and bring them some food, bring them some news and encouragement. And before they left, they'd take away some books, some papers, some drawings. And that way, a lot of this material ended up in Christian hands.
Well, how about the faith perspective? How did saving these treasures encourage the Jewish community about faith and commitment to their belief?
The rescuers, some of them were believers, some of them were not. For the believers, the religious books, Bibles in Hebrew, Talmud, other religious books were of special significance. I would say all of them had a perspective of eternity, if I can use that phrase. Even the non-religious members of this brigade, which was, when I say perspective of eternity, I mean they were very aware that they themselves probably won't survive. They'll probably be murdered by the Nazis. But if the books survive, if these cultural treasures survive, something will live on beyond them for many generations. And so so I think even for the secular members among this work brigade, there was a deep spiritual dimension to what they did, which is to think not only about yourself, but to think long-term about future generations.
The Women's March on Washington, rallies and riots on college campuses, and now protests against guns. Don't expect demonstrations like these to go away anytime soon. Joining us to explain why is Dr. Charles Durbur. He's professor of sociology at Boston College and author of the book, Welcome to the Revolution, Universalizing Resistance for Social Justice and Democracy in Perilous Times. So, Dr. Durbur, without beating around the bush here, how would you say that these demonstrations, even riots and violence in some instances, differ from what we experienced in the 60s and 70s? I mean, some people would say they're tearing away the fiber of American democracy, and I'm sure other nations wouldn't even tolerate such behavior.
I think because people since the 1960s have felt increasingly disenfranchised, understanding that government is being driven by a small cadre of people, as the Occupy Wall Street movement called it, the 1%, who don't share their general interests, and people feel very disenchanted. Under those conditions, the main way that people have an opportunity to express themselves when they feel that the electoral process is failing them and that the structures of power that kind of dominate both policy and discourse are being taken away from popular will, is to get out on the streets and express yourself. And I think Trump's election kind of created a trigger point. It was not so much that Trump was bringing something fundamentally new. It was simply that his election and some of the oddities and fear associated with it simply triggered what was really a decades-old sort of set of popular malaise, discomfort, economic decline. The Women's March was arguably the largest day of protest in the United States and in the world. We had about 5 million people, and not just in the United States, although there were millions in the United States, but in Europe and around the world. When you speak of violence, what's characteristic of this resistance, which is most hopeful, is that it's overwhelmingly nonviolent. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a lot of problems.
But I know on the day of the inauguration and then later on at Berkeley in California, Antifa and others turned very violent. They smashed windows, they beat people up. I mean, obviously you're not talking about that, are you?
No. I mean, I think that, you mention these things probably partly because these things get a lot of attention in the media. I mean, violence, unfortunately, one of the ways people feel they get attention is by smashing windows or whatever. This is a very, very, very small percentage. But let me just tell you the core idea of my book, which is that the resistance and sort of progressive movements generally, probably since the Reagan Revolution or since even the 60s. In the 60s, you had a figure like Martin Luther King, a spiritual figure who started as a civil rights activist and sort of, I think, could rally much of the country, but not all. But anyway, the violence there was obviously by people in the South who did not want to see segregation and so forth. And, King was violently attacked and killed when he finally made the connection between, on the one hand, civil rights, secondly, the Vietnam War, sort of like a process of connecting the dots. This is part of the history of resistance, so that people rise up against a particular thing that they feel very passionate about. It could be racism, it could be protection of religious rights, it could be women's rights, it could be poverty.
With social media, there are many voices. It seems like we're very polarized. What needs to be done?
If you ask what can unify the country, I mean, I think in one way is to recognize that the discontent on both the left and the right has some common origins and common roots, which I've already talked about, which is this sort of loss of control. I mean, Trump talked about wanting to drain the swamp. I don't think he's doing that, but that was his message for the forgotten people as he talked about them. And on the left, Bernie Sanders and people who are in the resistance themselves feel like they've been left out in some way, and that the Democratic Party is not speaking for them as well as the Republican Party, because both parties have been taken over by what Trump called the swamp, by which he meant lobbyists, people with a lot of money who are not speaking for the needs of ordinary people.
Well, it seems like that's where left and right can agree and come together. I guess maybe the solutions, that's where they may differ. But we're out of time, Dr. Charles Durbur, professor of sociology at Boston College. We thank you so much for sharing your perspective today.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Gary.
A new Gallup poll shows American college students are growing more concerned about free speech on campus. 61% of students questioned say the climate on campus prevents people from speaking freely, and that's up from 54% in 2016. Well, joining us from our Washington studio with more about the Gallup poll and speech on campus is Nicole Neely. She's president of the new group Speech First. Nicole, thanks for joining us. So tell me, why the growing concern from college students?
Well, it's interesting. Looking at the numbers growing year by year is discouraging, of course. To those of us who watch this issue, it's of no surprise. It seems like every single day there's a new horror story coming out of campus, be it someone like Christina Hoff Sommers being shouted down from a law school, a speaker fee being imposed on somebody like Ben Shapiro at another campus, or people who are not able to reserve rooms on campus for speakers they want. And so the fact that students are not able to express their views on campus, I mean, the fact that this is growing, frankly, I'm a little bit surprised that it only jumped by 7% from 54 to 61%.
Well, and I think they say that conservatives are less able to freely express their views. Is that correct?
It is, yes. Asking people across the whole spectrum of the poll, who do you believe is able to express views on campus? Liberals, 92% of people feel liberals can comfortably express their views, whereas people feel only 67% felt that conservatives were able to.
I understand fewer students, 70%, compared to 78% in 2016, now favor having an open environment on campus regarding speech. Why have we seen that drop?
Well, there's a question later on that actually asks, would you prefer an open campus or one that promotes inclusion and diversity? So I think in some ways students are being presented with this false choice. You can have one or the other. And what they really forget is that diversity and inclusion necessitates, you need free speech because that's how minority views get out there. And frankly, we in a Enlightenment tradition believe in rational discourse, using facts, using logic. And so if there are viewpoints that are simply not able to get out there, I mean, it really undermines the whole point of college altogether.
And what is the danger of this, Nicole?
Well, I mean, there's groupthink, certainly. There are students who do have closely held beliefs, like Christian beliefs in particular, that either they're afraid to speak up because they're afraid of retaliation. So they don't ask the questions they want in class. They maybe don't write the term papers they want because they know the teacher won't agree with them. They don't invite a speaker. They don't attend an event that they want. And so you have students who realize it's easier just to keep their heads down and keep their mouths shut than to rock the boat because they don't want to face retaliation. Some universities actually have something called a bias response team, where one student, if they overhear something offensive, can anonymously report them to this organization.
Yet Gallup found some interesting things about hate speech and student views on that. Tell me about that.
Well, 64% of people, almost 2/3 of them, believe that hate speech should not be protected. That was a little bit higher among women and among Democrats. I think it was 71% and 75% respectively. Unfortunately, it seems like they need a civics course. The First Amendment actually has no hate speech exemption. And so even if you don't like the speech, you don't have to listen to it, but you have to at least respect the ability of others to speak.
Okay, I'm sure there are many Americans that are glad you're there. Nicole Neely of the new group Speech First, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me anything about the Holocaust. What do you know about the Holocaust?
Not something that black guys like to want to know about.
What do you know about the Holocaust?
The Holocaust was the cleansing of the Jews in Europe, right? That's, they teach that in a lot of the history books. It doesn't matter if you're from north or south of the Dixon line.
All right, thank you.
Yes, I know it's around World War times, and basically Germany, I know it started around when Germany invaded Poland. I think it was 1939-ish, and basically they were holding Jews captive and torturing them, basically. So it was pretty.
Okay, all right, thank you. So what do you know about the Holocaust?
Not much. I mean, I know the basics, but so I know the basics of what happened, but I don't really know much specifics.
Can you tell me what happened?
The Jews were taken into camps and were executed, basically, or tortured.
I think it's a tragedy. What else do you want to know?
Well,
people were absolutely murdered, not just Jews, but people were outcast in society. Very calculated by Hitler. Hitler was a crazy but very smart man, and crazy comes with smart sometimes, so.
Oh, what can you tell me about the Holocaust?
It happened a really, really long time ago, and it was an event that brought people together as a whole as the outcome. And it's a good thing it happened because it was a unification of people.
Israel may be in grave danger. It seems the risk of war is greater than before. A war unlike any the Jewish state has experienced may be on the horizon. Could this be the calm before the storm? What is different than before, you may ask? Well, just last February, an Israeli jet was shot down after an Iranian drone made an incursion into Israel. It showed Iran was willing to directly confront the Israeli Defense Forces militarily. In the past, Iran has used its surrogate militia, Hezbollah, to do the fighting. Well, this appears to have been a test of Israel's defensive capabilities, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses in the event of a future conflict. Hezbollah now has at least 150,000 rockets and missiles in place in over 200 villages in Lebanon. Battle with Israel this time would be much more deadly than in 2006 because the number of rockets and missiles launched against Israel would be 10 times as many as before. They're more powerful and they can go up to 180 miles. That means Haifa, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem are now in range. Thousands more people on both sides of the Israel-Lebanon border would die this time around. The United Nations has limited the number of Lebanese troops along the southern border to 15,000. But now the Lebanese army has announced it plans to move more next to Israel. It comes as a Turkish newspaper reports that President Erdogan has urged Islamic nations to join forces with his country to overwhelm Israel militarily in a call to urgent action. CBN News senior international reporter Dale Hurd told us about it, and here's a brief clip from his story.
A Turkish newspaper closely allied with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his ruling party published an article in December entitled "A Call for Urgent Action." The Middle East Media Research Institute reports it's the brainchild of one of Erdogan's closest advisors. It looks like a blueprint for an Islamic military action against Israel. It calls on the 57 Muslim nations of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or OIC, to launch a joint military operation against Israel. Such an army would be mammoth. The OIC nations together make up more than 1.5 billion people. The plan calls for staging areas near Israel's border, from which an initial force of 250,000 soldiers would attack Israel.
Could this be Bible prophecy realized in our time? The war of Gog and Magog, predicted in Ezekiel 38 and 39? I posed that question recently to author Joel Rosenberg when we discussed his new novel, The Kremlin Conspiracy, which is about the rise of a new Russian czar.
The Bible says that Russia will become a major evil force in the last days before the return of Christ, that Russia and Iran and Turkey will form an alliance against Israel. Well, we're watching Putin build an alliance with those very leaders that the scriptures mention. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not necessarily at the point where the war of Gog and Magog, as it's called, is going to happen soon. But I don't know that we can rule it out either.
Folks, if ever there was a time to pray for Israel and the peace of Jerusalem, it may be now. The Bible tells us in Numbers 24:9, the nation is like a mighty lion. When it is sleeping, no one dares wake it. Whoever blesses Israel will be blessed. Whoever curses Israel will be cursed. And I don't know about you, but I'm guessing, like me, you'd prefer blessings instead of curses. So let's keep praying and blessing Israel. Well, that's it from the Global Lane this week from New York City. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, iTunes, SoundCloud, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.